So the title of my presentation is on a form of transhumanism, changing gender, sex, and sexual orientation. The idea that sexual orientation is absolutely not linked to sex and gender, but only results from a choice, has existed for a long time and is defended by the LGBT movement. The idea that gender is not linked to sex but could be chosen independently of it was developed more recently, that is to say in the 90s of the last century, by the inventors and promoters of the gender theory. The idea that sex itself is not a natural given, but results from an arbitrary assignment at the time of birth, so that the individual can subsequently change it according to his desire, appeared in logical continuity of gender theory. If previously there were always individuals who, with the help of medicine, changed their sex, they were very few in number and considered marginal. But over the last decade, gender reassignment has spread considerably among adolescents, to the point that an American scientific study called it an epidemic, noting the role of influencers on social networks. Supported by associations and under the pressure recognized as minority rights by social institutions, these ideas benefited from the legal protection of a large number of states, but also promotion within the framework of the school system. So that from originally marginal ideas, they have become a real social phenomenon, which is very worrying due to its consequences, because these ideas produce a subversion of the personal identities of the man and the woman, of the couple, sexuality, methods of procreation, the family, patrifiliation, and matrifiliation. It is not usual to situate these ideas and practices within the framework of transhumanism, because transhumanism is generally presented as an overcoming of the limits of the human beings and an improvement of their physical and mental capacities through new technologies, particularly in the field of genetics and digital technology. However, they claim to go beyond the representation of man, which is common to all societies of the past, as well as his individual, marital, family, and social mode of existence, and to create a new man going beyond the limits of the ordinary man. The first link of practices linked to gender theory with transhumanism is the refusal of nature as a given. Before the appearance of this theory and its applications, every man and woman accepted their gender and sex and sexual orientation consistent with them. Gender dysphorias, sex changes, and all allosexuality, for example, that is to say, sexual orientations other than heterosexuality, were considered unnatural, constituting anomalies, that is to say, as going against the laws, of nature, against the norms defined by it, and therefore being disorders or diseases. Transhumanism and practices related to gender theory are based on the postmodern idea that all norms, including those defined by nature, are relative and therefore contestable, and that they must be discarded as being obstacles to human progress and freedom. This leads us directly to a second link with transhumanism or practices connected to gender theory, which is the primacy given to freedom, considered as the power to do everything without any limit, not only for man in general or for society, but for each individual. Just as society considers itself free through the technical means at its disposal to change the nature of man, the individual considers itself free to choose its sex, its gender, and its sexual orientation independently of any reference to nature and any ethical standard. A third link is with atheist existentialism, whose main theologian was Jean-Paul Sartre, who asserts that nature, if we consider it as created by God, is defined a priori and therefore deprives man of his freedom to define himself as he wishes. God is therefore a major obstacle to freedom. By considering that God does not exist, we free man from this obstacle, and make him free. For the formula essence precedes existence, Sartre substitutes the formula existence precedes essence, which means that man exists first as an indefinite being and then defines himself freely, all possibilities being open to him. Dostoevsky had foreseen this logic, which ultimately leads to the negation of all norms, when he wrote, "If God does not exist, everything is permitted." Connected to gender theory, this gives the principle, the gender and sex I want, when I want, how I want. Man thus poses himself as a Promethean approach, in a Promethean approach, as a substitute for the Creator God. To be like God was the temptation proposed by the devil to the first man. Postmodern man, in all forms of transhumanism, yields in a renewed way to this temptation, especially since he has to act on nature, techniques unknown until now, whose perfectibility leaves him assume that he will one day possess absolute power through them. With regard to sex, medical techniques which until now were used for restorative purposes are being diverted from their use. Hormonal treatments, for example, which are used to treat hormone-dependent cancers or to fight osteoporosis, are diverted from their primary purpose to produce a change of sex. Medically assisted procreation, originally intended to help traditional couples having difficulty procreating, is used to allow single women or homosexual couples to have children. In this area, transhumanism is not only characterized by an overcoming of the natural capacities of the human being by means of techniques, but by a dehumanization characterized by procreation independently of the personal relationship of a man and a woman united by love, but also, in the case of male homosexual couples, by the use of surrogate mothers, falsely called mothers, because they have no maternal role and only rent their uterus while being exploited for a time as biological objects. I have shown elsewhere that there is a large element of illusion in transhumanism, in particular that which consists of believing that we can overcome human finitude by technical means. Despite its belief in infinite progress, transhumanism comes up against the limit of the human body defined by its nature. For example, aging in a natural process that cannot be prevented. When diseases are overcome, other diseases appear. Thus, despite all the progress in medicine, we see in old people an increase in degenerative diseases, Parkinson, Alzheimer, dementia, and so on. In the field of transidentity, the illusion and these limits are also seen. A man who considers himself a woman does not necessarily become a woman. In the same way, a woman who considers herself a man will never be a man. He or she who considers himself or herself not to be of any gender inevitably wears the gender of his or her own sex. The rest is only fantasy, or only based on the conception which in philosophy is called idealist, according to which reality is nothing other than the idea we have of it. When transidentity takes the form of a sex change, the same limits exist. A man undergoing hormonal treatment and a surgery which forms a vagina will never become a woman. A woman who undergoes a massive testosterone boost and has surgery to form a penis will never be a man. Those who are in this situation clearly perceive this gap, and it causes a certain discomfort in them, whether they admit or hide it. Nature itself takes revenge when it is thwarted. Among adolescents in transition, puberty blockers and hormonal treatments produce serious illnesses, cardiovascular disorders, osteoporosis, cancers, etc., and psychological disorders generally, in the form of depression, which leads a certain number of them to suicide. Many of these adolescents who have become adults regret having been transformed and perceive the changes they have undergone as mutilations. To these problems must be added those of another type, which concern the psychological harm suffered by children born through artificial procreation of a single parent or a homosexual couple. Christian anthropology, based on the biblical narrative of Genesis and on patristic commentaries, considers that the nature of man is double. There is the original nature as it was created by God, and there is fallen nature, which carries a certain number of defects. Original nature has a normative value. It cannot be changed, for example, in its genetic definition, which includes the difference between the sexes, out of respect both for the Creator who made it as perfect as possible, and for man whom changes risk distorting to his detriment, making him a partially or totally dehumanized being, in other words, a non-human. This nature of man, like that of all created beings, has limits that are specific to his species. For example, man is not made to fly or to live underwater. And these limits must be assumed with humility and respected by man. They are part of its definition, logos. This is also the case with the gender and sex that man and woman have been given respectively, each somehow lacking certain abilities that the other possesses. This difference between man and woman can be seen with its limits, since one is not the other, but also as a wealth which is appreciated within marriage in the complementarity of an harmonious union. Unlike gender theory, Christianity does not perceive the difference between man and woman as inequality. In his eyes, their identity of nature and value is marked by the fact that they are both a human being, anthropos, created in the image of God before being a man, arsen, and a woman, thili, which Genesis indicates by saying God made man, just before saying male and female, he made them. This inequality of man and woman, which is observed at different levels, which justifies a certain number of criticisms expressed by gender theorists, and which partly motivates the desire of certain people to change gender or even of sex, is a social phenomenon which results from the crystallization of certain passions of fallen man, in particular the spirit of domination, aggressiveness, and sexual passions, more marked in men than in women. The same is true of the violence suffered by women at the hands of men, which is currently the subject of legitimate denunciation in Western societies. A change in social structures alone is not capable of remedying these problems, nor the abolition of genders, not the sidelining of the masculine gender made by radical feminists referring to gender theory. The remedy proposed by Christianity is ascetic. It is in the fight against the passions which are the sources of inequalities and conflicts which exist between men and women within society, but also within couples. It is also the practice of the corresponding virtues, in particular chastity, gentleness, humility, and spiritual love. When the mind and heart of man and woman are purified of the passions, each sees the other with the qualities specific to their gender and being as bearer in their nature of the same image of God, destined for same title to acquire his likeness, identically saved by Christ and called to be deified in him. Both understand and live the words of St. Paul, in Christ there is neither male nor female. The virtues allow man and woman to lead an harmonious life and also fruitful and in reciprocal emulation. Spiritual life in the virtues also allows for a certain fluidity of gender, as we see in lives of women who were martyrs of holy ascetics. Virility, which is fundamentally characterized by courage, becomes a feminine virtue and no longer just a masculine one. Gentleness, compassion, tears, which are a priori feminine characteristics, are appropriated by virtuous men. In the spiritual life in Christ, a transfiguration or a spiritual overcoming of the masculine and the feminine, which remain but lose their psychological limits. It is an aspect of Christian transhumanism whose complete form, which extends beyond the distinction of genders, is deification, where the nature of man, while being preserved, is elevated by grace beyond itself. Thank you for your attention.